Thanks for stopping by, you guys. Let me explain what I'm doing. So I'm actually working on a breviary cover. It's a leather book cover. I'm actually doing two of them. This is just a book of prayers that a Catholic priest would use. They usually come in a 4-volume set like this. We're going to do two different covers with this design here. So he sent me a design that he wanted to use. It's kind of a glorified Jesus over a little town here, a city. Went and traced it to tracing paper that it just makes it easier for us to transfer this directly onto a piece of leather. Which you take your tracing paper, you lay it right over your leather like this. And because the leather is a little bit soft, when you take a ballpoint pen and you write over this and just trace the lines, you're left with these indentations. And if you can see right in his cloak there's some indentations that I have not gone over with a pencil yet. Once you transfer it, you'll see those indentations, and then you just take a pencil. I use an 8B pencil, and I draw over that because it shows up pretty well on the leather. I've got a real basic outline of where I want my tooling to go. Now I'm trying my best to make sure that these are the same as best I can, because they're going to be the same cover. We're using a vegetable tan leather that's about 6 ounces. That gives you an idea of how the thickness, when you're talking leather, it's always in ounces. But I always do a little bit thicker cover because I want to, when I do the tooling and the pounding, you want a little bit of a thicker material so that your cuts and the pounding is deeper in there, so that it just stands out a little bit more three-dimensional. I will use a thinner material, thinner leather for the inside book flaps, because those don't need to do anything other than hold the book. All right, you guys, so what we're gonna do now is we wanna prepare this leather to be tooled. And so the first step is to actually adhere some packaging tape to the flesh side of the leather. So what that's gonna do is make sure that when we're tooling everything, as you're pounding and you're cutting everything, it's not gonna start stretching, because if you don't kind of hold everything together, this can start stretching on you and actually make kind of a weird shape. I'm gonna go ahead and line this up and start putting my packaging tape on. And I just wanna seal the whole back surface. Don Gonzalez is the first one I watched do this, and it was kind of a game changer. So now I've got my tape on the back there. This will now allow us to go ahead and wet the leather, that's called casing, and start getting this ready to start tooling. So now I'm gonna go ahead and take some water, and I just use a sponge, just nothing special. I just use a sponge with some water, and I'm gonna go ahead and rub water on all this surface of this leather. Now what's important is you don't wanna just do this side and not this side, because there's minerals and just things in the water that will actually discolor the leather. So if you only do one side, you're gonna notice the difference, especially if you do like a light dye or a stain. What you're expecting this to do is you want it to start turning back to more of like that natural color again. You can kind of see the different color difference here. So we want this darker color leather that's wet to start drying, to kind of start getting to more of that lighter color. Once you get that, that's when you know you're okay to start cutting and tooling. You guys, so you can kind of see this is drying out a little bit. I went ahead and wetted it again. So what I'm gonna do at this point is get my swivel knife out. So this is a swivel knife. Use this tool to cut our outline and kind of the main areas of our design. I'm gonna take a piece of leather that I use as a strop. And this is just Jeweler's Rouge. You can get this at leather stores too. But this is just going to help keep my edge nice and sharp. Tracing around the outside here. Some of these, curves right here, I'm gonna go back in with a different tool maybe on those. So we'll just keep here going with our main designs. Get his cloak, where the sleeve is here. A little bit. So now I've got all my tools. These are kind of the main ones I use. There's a lot of tools you can buy. It's called an edge beveler. I pound this in, it's gonna push everything down on this leather on the background so that everything else pops up. So let's go ahead and start doing that. Just pounding everything down around the outside. Like if you can see, there's a ledge there now, making this more three-dimensional. One thing too, just as you're doing this, you know, based on your design. So this doesn't have to be perfect because we're working with his clothes here, and those aren't going to be a perfectly straight line. And you can kind of be creative and take some creative license with how you want it to flow and where you want some creases to appear. So, and sometimes you just have happy little accidents, right? Like Bob Ross. You know, I've had to re-wet my leather, you know, a couple times as I've gone around here, but you can really tell when you're getting some really good, substantial punches here with your tools. You can see that this cloud sort of goes in front of this other cloud. So I'm gonna maybe drag this line and just sort of slowly let it fade out before it hits this building. How we get just a, you know, just kind of slowly fades away and it just comes to a point right there. So what I'm going to do is edge bevel this, and then we're going to actually turn our attention towards the other one because I want to make sure that I'm doing both covers at the same time, because I want to make sure that I'm kind of hitting and beveling kind of the same depth. And there's definitely different patterns that you will find. Like if I just do, let me see here if you can see that. So if I just do some non-consistent hitting, say I do one there, and do this, you know, I'm kind of going around the outside. Well, now you can see that I've sort of made this pattern that's not super smooth. And you know what, that's fine if that's kind of the pattern you're going for. That's totally cool. But you can kind of see the difference. So I'm gonna try to go back over this. It's still wet enough that I should be able to still smooth this out. Yeah, so you can kind of make them smooth. We're gonna do a little bit of a backgrounding tool over the top of these marks here. So you'll see what that looks like too. Just kind of bring this away, or lighten my pressure, I should say, so that it just kind of fades out. We're gonna run right into that building with these clouds. There's different background effects that you can do in here. So you can kind of see that it's just got some real subtle patterns. So I'm gonna take this and just lay this right on the side with my straight edge going right along the straight edge of the fabric. Okay, do you see that? So that's given just like a little bit of a background of effect, almost like a shadow of how that looks. Okay, so now we brought our other cover up to speed. So now we've done both sides, both covers. This sort of area with the buildings is kind of fun. I kind of enjoy this, and so I'm actually watching it kind of grow. That's why I keep turning it and doing one building at a time almost. But anyway, if I was to try to be more efficient, I would just hit all my left edges, you know, keep going so I don't have to turn it, and then turn it once, do all the other side. Might be a little more efficient. Maybe not, but I know when I do belts, that does help, because turning a belt is a lot more flimsy and hard to do because it's so long. But anyway, so this is kind of fun for me to do this area of buildings. I'll kind of hold this up a little bit higher so you can see. So that's just outlining the top for the most part of those buildings. So here's my smaller edge beveler. So here's the two different sizes. Kind of see the difference. Anyway, quite a bit smaller. So I'll probably use that on some of these houses too, with the windows and things like that. and pulling and slowly letting go so that those lines just sort of fade away. So I'm going to take my edge beveler, go through here, top part of his cloak so it stands up, and pushing, pounding down the bottom part of his cloak. And I do notice it's getting a little dry here. Now I'm going to go ahead and work down here underneath on the back side of his garment. You want to be kind of careful, like this line here we did earlier, you know, that bevel area. When you get it wet, that could potentially lift back up. And so I want to be a little careful that I don't go back over that. It's not a big deal. I can repound that if I need to. But I just try to stay working and not re-wet the whole thing, because then your cuts and your indents will kind of start raising up a little bit with that water. They won't go away, but they'll just not be as sharp. Some simple little cuts here that are pretty minor. I really like these curls, and I'll show you what I'm going to do to make those stand out even more. Comes out like this, cuts in here. This one kind of comes down like that. There's a little bit one right here. Okay, so what I'm going to do for these curls, where they're kind of a circle in there, I'm going to take my lifter tool here. I'm going to try to get into that cut. I'm going to try to get into that cut and really lift it. It's a tool that they use for lifting the leather. So I'm going to try to really get down as far as I can deep and just lift it up. Wet this again, because I want this to be pretty wet, because that really helps with that lifting and you're kind of molding it. So I want that to be a little wetter. These two areas here. And I'm just kind of lifting it like that. Hopefully you can see how that turned out. So it's really cool. It's a really neat effect. Go a little bit farther this way to kind of round that out and keep that shape. But you can see how that really lifts that fabric up like that. And there's a lot of uses that you can use for that. I'll probably go back in here and just try to, you know, kind of round this out a little bit with my tools. But yeah, I really like that effect. Okay. Yeah. It just brings that up a little bit, you know, it kind of makes it look a little more realistic. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and keep going. Might bring this, and I'm just kind of looking with my eyes just to see, you know, from a fabric perspective, where would I assume, you know, I might see some, you know, different places where there's a bend or a crease or something like that. I'll show you what I'll do here with his halo. So when you're cutting with a knife, you know, with your swivel knife, to do a circle, it's a little tough to make it perfect. It's just a real subtle halo. So instead of trying to cut that, what I did in the other cover, and what I'm going to do on this one, is I'm going to use a template here of holes. So I'm matching up with this hole here over his head. So I'm going to take this here, and I've got an awl. It's just a simple awl that you can use for stitching, but it's just a really sharp point. So I'm going to take this and just draw the circle out with my awl. Careful not to go over any of the other design, because it does run into his cloak. And I'm just doing this nice indentation. Now I can, and I might, go back over that with a knife, but it's a pretty subtle halo, so I may not do that. Now we'll work on his hands and kind of his sleeves out here. Just re-wetting the hands here. Hands can be tough, especially how small these are here. And I'm using something that's this big. Sorry about the light. There we go. So I just did kind of just a real basic shape with my knife. Okay, so now I'm going to use my lifter tool again, my shaper tool here, to kind of shape these round edges of the knife, the fingers. So I'm just putting them down. I'm just pushing down on my lifter because it does have, you know, this edge here that's rounded. You can see that. And then our fingers go down here. So there's our hand. I don't want to do too much, but yeah, that gives you the idea that that's his hand, right? So kind of re-wet those areas. I'm kind of rounding these edges of his shoulders because this fabric is kind of going down. I'm just helping it follow this line so that it looks more natural and realistic. Okay, now we'll go ahead and work on his other side here, his other hand. So there's sort of where we're at. Okay, now we're going to work on Jesus's face here and his head. His hair, and actually I can go back to my edge beveler because this can be a little more dramatic around his beard. right, so there we go, you guys. So there's Jesus's face. I thought it'd just be kind of fun too. So here's a dime, just to give you an idea of the size of his head. And here's the knife that I was using. You know, here's our two guys. So we're close. We're close. Okay, you guys, we've got our covers done. We're ready to go. We've got our Fibings Light Brown Pro dye. So this is the dye that I typically use. Take my dye and just get my t-shirt wet and just start working into the cover. And I'm just rubbing this in different areas, you know, and it looks a little like clouds, but I'm just trying to give it an effect almost like it's a marbleized, you know, kind of a random pattern. You'll see it's pretty nice and dark there. That's kind of neat. We'll do the other cover now. And if you look, I have not taken off my plastic packaging tape yet, because I don't want to get any dye or anything on the back side of this. I want to keep this as clean as I can. That's just kind of a, you know, making it look professional. What I'm also going to do is I've cut my inside book jackets for these covers. So I want to do these at the same time, since I've already got my dye out. I'm already doing it, and then I'll know that this is the same color, and I can just do it at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and do these as well. Okay, so it's really a neat, you know, it's really neat effect, that dye. One thing I want to show you too is when you turn this, you know, some of these cuts are pretty intricate. So I do take a paintbrush and I will follow along, and if there's any spots that I think I didn't get any dye on, I'll go back in with my paintbrush and try to get those cracks filled in. It's not as important if you antique paste the project, but there, I think I've got most of those cracks filled in. What we're going to do next is we're going to assemble our covers and put our book jackets on the inside here. So we're going to take off our tape, and you can see right here, this would have been on my leather if I would have stained this without leaving that tape on there that we used when we initially tooled it. So that gives you a little bit of a barrier. That just helps make things look clean. I mean, there's a little another mark here. Those things, and especially if you're using antique paste, that paste can get everywhere too. So it's just nice to leave that on as long as you can, just to save yourself any struggle with trying to clean that later. See that? Boy, I mean, if we had a spot there, actually, it wouldn't have been a big deal there because we have our covers, our book jackets would have covered that. But it's just nice not to have to fight that. I kind of like it when it's all rough like that. I think that looks a little more authentic. Kind of like you got an old leather cover from the 1800s. Anyway, so we've got that done. And we're going to use a product for assembly called our Leathercraft Cement. This is also from Fibings. Leathercraft Cement. There's another product that I've used before too called Barge. And Barge is really, I mean, it's got the, you know, extreme danger. So it's a little bit rough. It's a little more potent. It smells really bad. But for what we're doing, I mean, that's, when you use this will really adhere the leather to each other. And you wouldn't even need to use like stitches or anything for the most part, depending on how you're assembling it. But we're just, for our for what we're doing here, we're putting this on because we just want it to hold this in place, and it doesn't need to be permanent. It can hold it there for a long time, and it actually could become permanent. But we just want it to sit in place while we stitch it. So once it's stitched, we don't really need the glue there anymore. The stitching is going to be what holds it together. So we're going to go ahead and open up our Leathercraft Cement, and I'm going to kind of eyeball this just first to see, you know, look at your pieces. Which side do you want? Oh, I probably want this there's a little mark there. I probably want that to go a little lower. And you just have to kind of think through as you flip it, where do you want this glue to be? You don't want it to be on this side, because if you did that, then this side gets glued down and then you can't fit your book underneath there. So just kind of think through, and trust me, I've done that before. So don't ever feel bad. Kind of put our glue there, and it doesn't have to be a real thick bead. Like I said, you just want this to hold that piece of leather that's going to be used as the book jacket. Let me go ahead and press this down and try to get that flush everywhere. And if you need to, you can go back and cut, you know, and shave off pieces if you need to get that to be flush on certain areas. Okay, so that's pretty good. One thing I will say is make sure you have a piece of, you know, a napkin or something handy, because you'll have some glue start coming out the side. You can see that glue coming out that side right there. Oops, see that glue coming out right there. So we'll just use paper towel to wipe that. What can be dangerous is if you touch that with your fingers and then you touch your leather, it'll leave a mark. And a lot of times it's pretty hard to make that mark go away. And so I try to be as clean as I can when I'm doing this. And you know, you can run your fingers over it and that's fine too. But you want to make sure that you don't have any glue on the table, any glue on your fingers, because it will leave kind of like this halo effect. So just keep that in the back of your head when you're doing it. Oops, see that? I got glue right there. See that, how I did that? So I'm gonna quick wipe that off, but you can see, it's real subtle, but you can see how that leaves just a hair of a mark. And based on the way that I hold it, and I get to see that in the light, that's on there. And so we'll go back. We still have to do our finish on there. And that's so minor, that's not gonna be a big deal at all. But I throw that out there because there's times where you might be working on a project and you get glue on an area and it's just really hard to clean that. And it's avoidable. I mean, it's kind of tough when you're working with stitching and glue and all this stuff and you got stuff on your table. But so it can be kind of a problem, but I can see that this is kind of over the edge a little bit, so I'm gonna try to fudge that back down there a little bit. It's still wet, so it'll still move. After about 20-30 seconds though, this stuff sets in pretty good and you're at the spot where you're gonna be. It's not gonna let you move it a whole lot unless you wanna rip it off there and reassemble it. Well, what I'm gonna do is go around my edges and take a scalpel and just make sure that it's all nice and crisp and clean. Okay. So there's our cover right there. We still have to do a lot of finish work to it, but that gives you an idea of what it'll look like. Okay, so what we're moving on to now is what's called burnishing. And burnishing is just when you get the leather wet and you cause a friction, it's actually going to burn or burnish the area that you're rubbing with to make friction. So when people use, make wallets, book covers, things like this, they want these edges to be nice and, nice and smooth and shiny even. And so we have a process that we use for that. So we have got our burnishing tool here. This is the one I primarily use. You can also use, there's different models and styles here. This is a simple one with one groove. So you're going to get these edges wet, and not soaking wet, but you're gonna take your sponge that we used initially when we were doing our carving and get these edges wet. And we're gonna take our tool and just start rubbing. And we've got different grooves to kind of match how thick our leather is. So you can experiment with different sizes, but we're going to use that and start burnishing these edges, and you'll kind of see what happens. So that's what it looks like right now. And I'll show you what happens after we're done. We'll take our sponge and just wet our edge. And I only go one edge at a time because by the time I would go all the way around with the water, it's gonna dry. So, and you don't want it soaking wet. And I don't bevel the edges. We have edge bevelers that we can use, but for this project, we're not going to use that today. So we're taking our edge, getting it wet. And now I'm just going to burnish this. And that is just me rubbing really fast. You can see how that's starting to get darker. As you get a little shiny. Then what I'll do, after I've got that shiny, and I'll show you, here's an example of, this is before and after. So now I'm going to take my other tool, which is something I use all the time. This is our shop rag, okay? And this is just a piece of canvas from a pair of pants. I'm going to take that and just rub this edge. And I just like how that gives that a real, just a dark border. And you flip it over, get the other side too. It's nice and smooth and shiny. And once we get our, we'll finish it with a dye to match. So this is something that we use when we do our second pass. We'll put our saddle soap on here, and you just rub it on here. It's just like a bar of soap, old school. You go ahead and start burnishing now with that saddle soap on there. And a lot of these processes can be interchanged. Like if you wanted a tan coat, and I've mentioned it a couple times now, but if you wanted a tan coat, you could have done that first. That's fine too, but I'm just trying to find the best way to be efficient. It's really about getting that friction going. And like I said, it takes some elbow grease. So we'll go ahead and do this edge again. Flip it over. Okay. So now you can see our edge, like it's nice and smooth and shiny. I don't know if it shows up very good on the camera, but here's an original edge. Here's our other book that we're doing. There's that edge, and here's our burnished edge. It just, to the touch, it just feels a lot more professional than kind of rough. Okay, now that we've got our edges burnished, we ended up going over that about 3 times with the burnishing tool, just really making sure that those are nice and crisp edges. What we want to do now is we want to just dye those so they match the rest of the cover. So I'm going to take my Fibings dye, light brown, and I'm going to use my dauber this time, and just stick that in there. Doesn't have to be real wet. And I'm just going to hit these edges with that dauber. You can kind of see it might spill over a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and take my shop rag and just run it once along the sides here, just to clean up anything that may have bled over. So our next step is going to be to tan coat this. And what tan coat is
is it's a product that will actually protect your cover. I'm just going to apply this. And I just want to rub it into kind of in swirls like this. And I'm using a paper towel, and look at that, you can see how that kind of rubs some of that off. So just be aware of that as you're doing your projects. And I've talked about it in different videos too, this process. And just, it does dry fast. If you happen to get your fingerprint in there, it will leave, it'll show your fingerprints. So just make sure you go over it a few times and try not to get your fingerprints in there. Okay, so there's our cover. I'm gonna do the other one. I do make a product that's just homemade that I kind of just use personally for things. Is I'll use olive oil and beeswax and use that as a kind of a conditioner and waterproof protector of your leather. And that's really all the two products. If you have something that you want to store long term, I think you'd have to add some vinegar to it as well, but I do have some of that I use as well. But I'm just going over this multiple times. I just want to get it to the point where I'm not really pulling a whole lot of color off. Okay, and we want to make sure we also do our edges and the back. So we're going to take this and just rub this along the edges too. So we're able to make sure those are protected. Okay, now we're going to do the inside flaps. And you know, one pro of not doing this when it's connected is you won't hit inside here and potentially discolor this a little bit. It'll be pretty minor, but that's one aspect. I'm pretty careful when I get to the edge right here, so I'm not too worried about it. And I like to get everything assembled and kind of look at it as one whole piece. Those colors are good. We're going to end up going, when it's all said and done, I'll hit it with some olive oil and just really condition it again. But there's our cover. So the next step we're going to move on to now is the stitching. What we have here are some tools, and I'm going to just talk through. So this is a stitch groover. And what a stitch groover is it's got a little notch here, a real sharp spot on the end that might be kind of hard to see. But when I pull this, I can set it by turning this. I can set the distance that this bar moves here back and forth. But what's going to happen is this is going to ride along the very edge of my leather. I'm going to pull it and it's going to make a groove. It's actually going to take out kind of like a string of leather like this. It's just going to take this out of the leather, but it gives you a groove and a nice straight line that you can use as you start punching your holes for the leather. What we're going to use for our punching are these stitching forks, and you can get these in a variety of sizes and distances. You know, I think these are 4 millimeter distances. But what that allows you to do is punch these in to your leather and kind of pre-drill these holes, pre-punch these holes, so that you can go back and use your, you know, these are just I think I picked these up at Joann's Fabric or Michael's or something like that. These are just hand stitching needles, and I think they were tailored towards leather. I don't exactly know the size, but if you wanted to know, I could look them up. Anyway, so that's what we're going to use those, and we're going to pound those stitching forks in with just a simple hammer. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And I'm going to pull this down, and I'm not going to be real, I'm going to go very gently. I'm just going very gently, and I'm pulling this along, and you can see based on how far I want this gap between the very edge of the leather and my groove, I can change that by just adjusting that screw here. Just drag that along there. Yeah, there you go. So you can just see it does make, you know, it removes just that real top layer of leather just to give you a groove. And I don't go very deep at all. I just try to keep it real subtle. Let's go ahead and punch our holes. And one thing with punching your holes, you want to have something underneath. Like I'm working on a piece of granite countertop here. And if I were to punch through my leather, I mean, you can just imagine this is going to go through both sides of the leather. And it's going to drive right into whatever's below it. So in order to keep these nice and sharp, you're going to want to have some sort of material underneath it as you go from the top of the leather down through it. So I'm just doing my best to line that up right on that line. I don't know if you can see that or not, but I'm going right along that line with my fork. You're going to want to pound this straight up and down. If you're angled at all, that's going to screw up the back side of your leather, like where your flap is. That's going to look different than the front. So if you can try to keep that as straight up and down as you can, so you can see how that went through the other side. But yeah, just do your best to keep that as straight up and down as you can. It'll always look good on this side, but the back side might not look as good based on where the holes are coming out because of your angle. And I just keep checking both sides to make sure that I'm looking okay. If you happen to get off and you're angled funny and you're coming out the side of your cover or something, that's not the end of the world. You can go back and I'd hit it from the other side, the inside, and try to punch those holes from the back side, so that way you're not coming through this side, and you can kind of fudge that if you need to. But you just see how we're going right through. Okay, I'm just gonna make my way around the cover, and when we're all done, we'll come back and I'll show you how to stitch. So one thing I forgot to mention was when you're doing your punches, as you start going here, depending on how many you have, this one has 6 punches on this fork. So as you go to the next 6, you actually rest in the 5th hole, or I'm sorry, on the 6th hole. So that gives you a guide. Then you're only punching 5 more, but by using that previous hole, you're keeping that spacing correct, number one, but it also gives you kind of where a good starting point to know where to go for the next 5 punches. So you just keep doing that, and you keep overlapping. You're just overlapping that last one. When you get to the end, like I am here, I'm almost at the end. If I put my, stitching fork there, I'm gonna run off the edge of the leather, just barely. And I don't like where that's gonna land. And so what I'm gonna do is back it up. I'm gonna go in the last 2 holes, right there. It's gonna leave me a little short, but then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come back here and start fresh on this side. And if there's a big enough gap that I feel like it's noticeable, I'm gonna use a 1 punch to just punch in between that gap to make it a little less obvious. I'm gonna put my fork in there and punch that. Come out of here. And actually it's gonna be about perfect. So I'm just gonna skip this last hole because it'd be a little bit too long. Then I'm gonna go along this side, make sure that I get it right in my groove. Went through. And now you can see when I punch that, that's my corner, and it looks kind of funny right there, but you won't notice that as we do our stitching. But that's the way to kind of go around the corner if you're going to be long with your forks. And I've got different sizes. I've got a 2 fork here based on what I'm doing. I've got a 1 fork. But on this situation, I didn't need to use it, which is great. So now I'll keep going here. One thing I'm going to try to do is I'm going to count from the very corner. I'm going to count how many holes I've got so that I can match it on the top. That's one thing to do, to just make sure that it's always symmetrical, professional, etc. And I'm gonna count here so that I make sure I've got 6 there, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Okay, so I've got 17 holes this way. I wanna make sure from this hole here in the corner that I only have 16 more holes, so that I'll have a total of 17 on this edge as well. And a lot of times I'll take my first fork there, and I'll kind of just push it in with my fingers, and that gives me a real rough indentation, a real light indentation of where my stitching fork is going to go, so that what I can do is I can actually move it over if I wanted to to this next line here instead of going right off the edge. And the reason I wouldn't maybe want to go right off the edge here with this first punch is because then I'm actually making sort of a cross with that first hole. I'm punching it this way and I'm punching it this way, and I hate to go any bigger and get too close to that edge of my leather. So I'm just gonna move it right over to my next indentation that I made after just pushing it in with my fingers. So now I'm gonna line it up with that and punch it. Okay, so that's after making that corner on the top. Okay, so let's just double check we got our math right. 6, 12, 17. Okay, perfect. All right, so now we're good on this side. We'll move to the other side. And once we punch these holes, we'll be able to stitch. The thread that we use quite a bit of when we're doing hand stitching is this wax thread. And this thread here comes from Maker's Leather Supply. I'm not sponsored with them or anything, but they sell really good thread, tiger thread, things like that. But this is just a wax thread. I think it's a chestnut color is I believe what it is. Anyway, so it's a real nice thin thread that we use. What we're gonna do is when we're trying to measure out how much string we're gonna need or how much thread we're gonna need for our stitching, what I found that works really consistently is to measure out my string, my thread, and kind of just lay it out based on, you know, just taking it along the sides here, wherever I'm gonna stitch, and right there, that would consist of like one pass around the outside of where I'm gonna stitch. So what we wanna do then is do that 2 more times. So I take that mark right here and I go back up here, and then I measure this out again around the corner. That's 2. And then I take this and I do a final pass, and that's 3. And a lot of times I kind of do that a little bit, you know, pretty loosely, because you don't want to be short. I mean, it's not a huge problem if you're short, because you can just you can backstitch and then you know, reload another stitch in there and kind of lock it back in. But it's so much cleaner and nicer if you can just get it all the way done. I mean, sometimes we've had projects, you know, a big leather apron or something that'll be hand stitching that will take quite a bit of thread. And so then it becomes a little bit problematic trying to just manipulate and maneuver around with all that extra thread hanging down. So, but on a project like this, if the general rule that I've found works is, and this is not my rule, I think somebody else said this and so I adopted it, but it's just to go around wherever you're stitching to do that, you know, multiply by 3. So you know you have 3 lengths of whatever that initial length is. So that's what we have here. I cut that to size. Actually, I think I went a little long. Like I said, it's always better to have extra if it's not too much of a problem with handling it. So we're gonna go ahead and thread our needles. And the tip and the technique that we're gonna use is called the saddle stitch. And so what this is we're going to thread the needle. And when you're doing saddle stitch, you're gonna actually work towards you. So you kind of have your project situated a certain way, and then you're gonna work always towards you, and we're gonna twist and then keep going, you know, along this way, but it's always working back towards you. So I'm gonna go ahead and put my needle in there. This is our first stitch, and I'll see if I can do this. I do have a stitching pony that I use sometimes, but a lot of times I'll just sit on a chair and just kind of put this between my legs and stitch that way, and it works out pretty well. But we're gonna go ahead and thread our other side. So we'll have a needle with our 2 needles here with our thread, and I'm gonna pull this. I'm gonna pull these strings tight all the way up, and you won't be able to really see this, but what I'm trying to do is stretch this out and make sure that I have this equidistant on both sides, okay? So as I pull this out towards me, it looks like I'm just about the same on both sides. Okay, I'm equal on each side of my string. So it's just basically where this is sitting is right in the middle of my big length of string. So I'm gonna work from left to right. I'm gonna take my string here, or my needle, and I'm gonna go in the next hole in the sequence. And depending on your stitching forks, how big of a hole it is, a lot of times I've got to kind of manipulate with my fingers and kind of make this hole a little bit bigger, and I'm going to pull that through. And I'm not going to pull it very far, so I'm just pulling it, you know, a few inches through here, about 6 inches or so. I'm going to let that hang there. I'm going to take my other string that was on the other side with my different needle, and I'm going to come back from the right, and I'm going to go into this hole that I just came through. Now, you have to, when you do this, you'll start getting good practice. When you do this, you pull on this side, because you don't want this needle to get inside of this thread, because then you kind of have a mess. But usually once I go into the right side like this, and then I'll take my left string and kind of pull it, and if it pulls nice and easy, then I know I'm good. And then you take this and you wrap it one time. So I just went one time around this needle, and then I'm going to pull this through to the other side. And now I pull both of my strings, and you're just cinching this up. And like I said, this is, you know, like you can kind of see how if you were doing a really long stitching pattern and you've got all this extra thread, it becomes hard to manage, like all this extra dangling thread. But now you can see that I've got this saddle stitch and it locks it in. So that's our first stitch, okay? So I'll do it again here so you can kind of watch. But like I said, we work from the left. We're gonna go through this next hole in the line. Like I said, I kind of move it around a little bit, make that hole a little wider so I can get it through there. I'm going to pull this side through. Okay, so now I have my strings, and I'm always trying to keep them separate, you know, so I kind of keep that away from this string. So I've got my string that just came through, I'm keeping it away from this string. I don't want them to get tangled. And so I've got this like this here. Now I'm going to take my string that's laying on the right side of my project and put that back through this other side and push that through. I'm gonna go back to this side and I'm gonna just pull slightly and just make sure that that slides through nice and easy, and it does. Then I'm gonna wrap it once, just one time around, and that's gonna lock that thread in. And I'm going to make sure my strings aren't tangled, pull them through on each side, pull them tight. But what happens sometimes is this needle will go through this thread, and then they're kind of stuck into each other, and then you can't do anything. And if you try to proceed, you potentially are threading thread through the other thread, if that makes sense. And then it's really kind of a big mess. And so you just want to always pull this side. That's one thing I've learned, is always pull the side, make sure it comes loosely, and then just wrap it. If it doesn't pull loosely, what'll end up happening is you'll end up pulling that needle with you, and it'll eventually pull off of there. So that's fine too. You just want to make sure that that string is not embedded in the other string, or it just becomes really problematic. Here we go. So I got this to work. So this is an example of what you don't want. So you can kind of see how that needle went through that string. And if I were to keep sewing, if I would not have pulled this out and I pulled the needle through, it would have went right through this string and everything would have appeared to be okay. But what would have happened as I made my next stitch or two, it would have started to have a problem, and there'd actually be a little bit of slack in this stitching. So you don't want that. So what you always do is you pull this side through. All right, so here's my, hopefully you can see that. You'll see that pulls off of there. Then you're separate from that. Now you're separate from the needle, and then so you're just gonna wrap it once, pull it through, and you're back in business. But I've just learned over time that if you don't check that, that can be a problem with your stitching. All right, you guys, so we're coming up on our last hole here. And I want to show you how to back stitch this and kind of lock everything together. So we're doing our last hole, pulling it tight. All right, so now you can see we've got our stitches going all the way to the end there. Now what you do is you flip this around, okay, and we're gonna back stitch. And just like using a sewing machine, you're gonna back stitch. We're gonna go three holes total of a back stitch. So we're gonna go back and do the exact same thing we were doing. We just flipped it around, and then we're gonna drive these needles through again. The same way we've been doing the whole time. Loop over the needle and pull it. Okay, so now we're just back stitching a couple of stitches. And it gets kind of tough because you got, you know, these holes aren't very big with the thread going back and forth through there. All right, so we go back and forth, going over their top again. Okay, so right there, we've got this going through 1, 2, 3 holes. I don't know if you can see that. Oops. So first hole, second hole, third hole. So we got the third hole. So now what I'm gonna do to finish this so it looks nice is I'm going to take this. Now this is my front cover. Okay, this is the front of my cover. I'm gonna take that needle and I'm gonna go through this side here. Okay, so I pull that through. I'm taking my needles off because I'm done. So I pulled that all the way through. There you can see. Okay, there's our stitching. And I'm pulling this through to this side. So what I want to do, since this is my nicer side with the front cover, I'm going to try to keep this as nice as I can. I'm flipping this over, and I'm just going to trim these 2 strings off pretty close to the end. And we can do that because we've locked everything in, and with a saddle stitch, everything's a knot, pretty much. So I'm going to go ahead and just try to cut this as close as I can to the end, leaving just a little bit out, so you can kind of see that. I'm going to take a lighter and just burn these ends, okay? See if hopefully I can get this in the camera. Just barely. Drop it right to my table, and I'm just gonna pound it a little bit. Okay, so then you can see how I've just burned those ends so that they're a little bit bigger, pounded them in so they're flush, and that just holds everything together. All right, you guys, so we are done. So our leather breviary cover is complete. We finished up all our stitching, all our edges are all nice and clean and done, tan coat. So these are awesome. I mean, this will last a really long time. This is real leather. This has just got a lot of heart and effort and time into this thing. It's gonna look better with age as it's just patinaed over time. And I mean, it's just, these are really fun to make. It's really nice and snug. I just really like how this feels in your hand. And so I'm glad that you could watch the process. So this is really neat for us. We love doing these. These are really where our passion is doing the breviary covers, especially. You know, it's a way for us to just talk about our faith a little bit too, and hopefully when people see these images, you know, they can kind of raise their hearts to God and pray with the book, so in the cover. But anyway, got to knock out the other one still. I've got to stitch that. We'll get those done and send off to the customer, and hopefully he loves them. But we appreciate your time and watching. And if you have any questions or comments about what you saw in the video, or if there's something that I didn't discuss or I didn't go into in enough detail, just let me know and I can go back over that and kind of answer those questions, or even make another video to kind of demo that. So anyway, thank you so much for your time. God bless you guys. Do you need me for something?
There's a spider in there.
Okay, I'll get it in just a minute.
It's just a little.
I'll get it in
It's
just a
a
minute.
tiny